Yeah, no, I'm aware of him. He's very eloquent, and I think a very honest man. And I admire him I had, as I admire the Jewish tradition of truth telling, which seems to have disappeared in Israel, but is alive and well everywhere else. He is an admirable man for his honesty and his bravery, because if you stand up and say the truth, as he did, you are punished by members of your own community.
As you just saw, this was US Ambassador Charles Freeman in my most recent interview with him, introducing my guest today, Rich Forer. But first, an urgent message. Have you noticed how the voices speaking truth to power are getting harder to find? That's no accident. This channel is one of the few that dares to bring you unfiltered, hard-hitting political interviews, and because of this, we have been shadow banned. How do we know? Well, because of YouTube's own creator statistics and thanks to a growing number of viewer comments like these. But there is something you could do. Get involved with just 2 or 3 clicks. When you subscribe, like and hit the bell button, you're not just clicking some buttons. You're making a stand for free speech and independent thought. Your actions are crucial in helping us breaking through the barriers of the mighty YouTube algorithm and to reach more critical minds like yours. And if you haven't yet explored our previous interviews, you're missing out on some of the most revealing and insightful conversations available. Our archives include whistleblowers like John Kiriakou, who risk it all to expose systematic torture in CIA prison camps, diplomatic mavericks like the US ambassadors Charles Freeman and Jack Matlock, or the Dutch ambassador Nicolaus van Dam, and activists like the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen or Ken O'Keefe, the former US Marine who, with his bare hands, disarmed 2 Israeli commandos whilst they shot and killed 10 people on the Gaza Freedom Flotilla in 2010. But now enough of this. Let's sit back and enjoy another powerful interview that challenges the status quo. And here we go. Rich Forer, thank you so much for joining. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me, Thomas.
My pleasure. Now, Rich, I know that you bought 2 books, at least 2 books. I found 2 books. Yeah. But for people who don't know you, in a nutshell, how would you describe yourself? Who are you, in a nutshell?
I am a Jewish American who was born in 1948, just a few months before Israel was established as a state. I grew up going to Reform Synagogue regularly until I was 14 years old. My identical twin brother, after he graduated from college, went and lived in Israel and eventually became an ultra-Orthodox, a member of an ultra-Orthodox sect, and is extremely right-wing. And I was very defensive all my life until 2006, whenever I heard criticism of Israel. I would say that the person making the criticism was probably anti-Semitic, or they didn't know what they were talking about. And I always defended Israel, even though the only book I ever read on the subject, on the Israel-Palestine subject, was a book called From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters, which was a bestseller. And it was written in the 80s, I think. My brother gave it to me in the mid 90s. And it basically became my Bible because it made every excuse for Israel's behavior that I had always dreamed of. But it turned out that the book was a farce. The book was, as historians and geographers in Israel itself, Zionist historians, as they themselves said, and as historians in the United States said, the book was worthless trash. It was propaganda. That Joan Peters mangled all the demographic statistics and didn't know what she was talking about. But what she did say, and this has been repeated throughout Israel society, is that there never was such a thing as a Palestinian people. They were other Arabs from other areas of the Middle East who came to Israel or to Palestine prior to the establishment of Israel as a formal state, who came to that area because they could receive better wages from Jewish landholders than they were making in their countries of origin. And so what happened was, do you want me to continue, or am I going on too long?
No, no,
Continue.
please, please, absolutely.
Well, in 2006, people may remember, Hezbollah from Lebanon conducted a cross-border raid into northern Israel, and they killed 3 Israeli soldiers and abducted 2. And that was very, very distressing to me, but especially because 3 weeks earlier, Hamas had captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on the Israel border, and they would subsequently keep him in captivity for 5 years before they exchanged him for over 1,000 Hamas militants or members, including Yahya Sinwar, who was the current head of the military wing. Anyway, so the combination of, in June of 2006, Shalit's kidnapping, or capture, I should say, and Hezbollah's attack on northern Israel, and that was common. These situations between Hezbollah and Israel were not uncommon. But this time, because Ehud Olmert was the prime minister and did not have a military background, he needed to assert himself as being just as firm as a military person. And so he ordered an attack on Lebanon. So the day after the killing and the abduction by Hezbollah, Israel attacked Lebanon. And over the next 3 weeks, they displaced millions of people, killed thousands, used horrible bombs that break up into little bomblets and cause severe damage to people. And many of them don't get triggered. So they end up laying in the fields, and they look like soda cans. And kids may pick them up and get totally maimed for life or get killed. Anyway, I supported Israel's invasion. I was upset, but I supported it. And then what happened was, I decided to speak to a couple of my close friends, neither of whom was Jewish, both of whom had been somewhat critical of Israel in the past, though it was never a big issue between us. But I thought, well, the horrible combination of the kidnapping of Shalit, the killing by Hezbollah, obviously these guys are going to understand that, finally they're going to understand that the Arab world wants to kill all the Jews and destroy Israel. Well, I spoke to them individually, and each of them individually disagreed with me. And they each blamed Israel for its disproportionate use of force against the people of Lebanon. So I was shattered by this. And afterwards, when I went home, I went over each of the 2 conversations in my mind to see if there was something I'd missed or misunderstood. And I concluded that there was nothing I had missed or misunderstood, and that it was probably the fact that only Jews can understand the suffering of our people, and that maybe my 2 friends, who were among the most compassionate, open-minded people I'd ever known, maybe they were anti-Semites. So, but then what happened was, a friend of mine from New Jersey, where I'd grown up, this was a friend I'd known since I was 3 years old, called me to tell me he was coming out west. I was living in New Mexico at the time, and he was going to visit me for a week. I said, fine. And by the way, the Arab world wants to kill all the Jews, blah, 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 for 2 hours. And my friend just listened to me. He barely interrupted. He never judged me. He never argued. But I knew, and he knew, that he had studied the subject for many years, and I hadn't. The only book I'd read was the ridiculous Joan Peters book. So at a certain point, my friend said, why don't you look up the writings of Baruch Kimmerling and Tanya Reinhardt, who are 2 well-respected Israeli professors, Jewish Israeli professors. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? Maybe there's something I don't know about this issue. Like most of my Jewish friends today, they have never studied the issue, and yet they think they know all there is to know. And that's how I was. But Sammy, my friend Sammy, because he hadn't argued with me, because he hadn't resisted my point of view and he let me just express it, he had given me the space to question myself. So after we hung up, I looked up books by Kimmerling and Reinhardt, and I compiled a list of other books on the subject, with the stipulation that I would read Jewish authors only. Otherwise, I was afraid I would encounter bias or anti-Semitism. So I drove over to my library and checked out a few books that I found that were on the list. And I went home and I started reading. And after about a week or so of uninteresting reading, I picked up a book by Norman Finkelstein called Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. And what was so interesting about his book is that, first of all, I recognized that he was a brilliant man when I was reading it, and that kept me engaged. And I already committed to myself that I was going to study the history without any bias, or with as little bias as possible. That I would keep as open a mind as possible. And Finkelstein's writing was totally critical of Israel. And every page, I would turn the page thinking, well, now he's going to say something that's critical to the Palestinians. But he didn't. But what he also did was he was quoting from Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, which is the Israeli Human Rights Center, in the occupied territories, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, three mainstream, reliable, well-respected human rights organizations. And everything he was quoting was confirming his criticism of Israel. But because I didn't even trust that he was quoting these organizations accurately, I would go online and find the document, find the report that, for example, Amnesty International had issued that he was quoting from, and I would find the passage he was quoting from, secretly hoping that I would catch him taking something out of context or changing a word here or there to make Israel look as bad as possible. And I could not find anything to criticize Finkelstein about. He was impeccable in his source material. And so at a certain point, as I was reading, I was so absorbed in what I was reading that I didn't resist the feelings I was experiencing. And like I would go through shock at what Israel is doing to these poor people, how horrible and sadistic Israel's treatment of them is. And then anger that Israel is doing this in my name as a Jew, and that for more than 50 years of my life, I had basically criticized and demonized character assassinated the Palestinian people as propagandists and as the cause of the problems in the Middle East. And then after I went through this anger towards Israel and towards myself, I felt embarrassed at how ignorant I had been all my life, and I felt shame. And then what happened was I felt this immense sorrow for the Palestinian people. And I realized that I had been more as responsible for their suffering as a soldier in the field. And I actually saw myself, I had a vision of myself as a soldier in the field. So then I decided to put the book down. I needed a break. And I closed my eyes. And I don't know how long my eyes were closed. I really have no idea. But when I opened them, I felt unbelievably cleansed and free, even blissful. And the state that I was in when I opened my eyes was so different than I had been in before that I actually started looking for the anger, the shock, the shame, the embarrassment in my bookcases and in the corners of my room, as if those emotions actually existed. And I was looking for it. I was actually scanning my room. And then I realized I'm not going to find those emotions anymore. And then I just relaxed. I sat back and relaxed into this newfound state of freedom and wonderment. And I had nothing to do. I had no interest in the future. I was not dwelling on the past. I was simply present. And then I happened to notice that I don't feel like I have a Jewish identity. And I thought that was a strange thought. So I actually inquired into my Jewish identity. And I could not find a Jewish identity. And then I realized I was as much Muslim or Christian as Jew, as much Palestinian or Arab or Chinese as American or Israeli. And I realized that I was no longer a separate self defending itself against any perceived enemy, because the separate self, or the ego, that defines itself by, for example, by a label such as Jewish or American, that separate self has beliefs and images that go along with that label, with those labels. And those beliefs and images form like a framework through which we see the world. It's like a veil that colors the way we see the world. So if I had an idea in my mind, as I had previously, that most of the world was anti-Semitic, I would judge events that related to Jewish people or to Israel through that veil. So if someone criticized Israel, it wasn't because Israel had done anything wrong. I never even considered that. It was because they were anti-Semitic, and that's why they're criticizing Israel. And there's a collective logic to this, Thomas. For example, when people would tell me that Jewish soldiers, that Israeli soldiers had killed Palestinian children or other civilians, I would get angry, and I would say that's ridiculous. Israeli soldiers are the most humane in the world, the most moral army in the world, and they only shoot at militants. They take great pains, even at their own risk, to only target militants. But because Hamas and these other terrorists embed themselves in civilian populations, sometimes a child will get killed. And it's Hamas's fault. It's the terrorist organization's fault that a child got killed. And they use that fact that a child was killed to make it look like Israel was targeting children. So they are actually embedding themselves for the purpose of slandering Israel to the entire world. And I never read this. I made it up. And almost every Jewish person I know who defends Israel has the same internal logic. They will arrive at the same explanation and defense of Israel that I did without reading anything. So I ended up, I'll make a long story short, I ended up doing voluminous research for many years. I mean voluminous, hours a day. And I mostly focused on information coming from the Israeli State Archives, the Central Zionist Archives, the Book of the Haganah, published by the Israeli Military Press, the archives of David Ben-Gurion, Yitzhak Rabin, the Israel Defense Forces archives, and the Palmach, the stormtroopers, Israeli stormtroopers, you could say, archives, paratroopers archives, Israeli Ministries of Defense, Foreign Affairs, and Internal Security, and that's where I got most of my information. And so I had to conclude, without any question, that there was never a single argument I had ever made or heard that was not either factually wrong, or if there was some truth to the argument, taken out of context for the sole purpose of character assassinating the Palestinian people and exonerating the state of Israel. So that's basically a short version, even though I went on for a while, but that's kind of a short version of my experience and how I got involved in this.
I tried to find the right words. It's a very interesting narrative, right? And what made you especially interesting for me was the fact that you went through a paradigm shift in your point of view, right? And not many people have this. Yeah. Now, one example, I don't know if you know him, there's Anthony Lehrman, who is the former executive director of the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. And a couple of months ago, I interviewed him. He had a similar transformation. And in between the line, and you can see it in the interview, I felt the regret, that it happened so late in his life. Yeah. That it was, how shall I say this? Again, I'm trying to find the right words here, but I'm a behavior analyst. Yeah, it's more than interesting. It was very deep. Yeah, and then, as you do, account this all in an open interview, right? So I really appreciate for you sharing the story.
You're welcome. Okay. I want to point out one thing. A lot of people have asked me, did you feel after you had this awakening where you recognized your common humanity with all people and became an advocate for human rights, for Palestinians in this case, did you feel guilt or regret or anger towards your parents or rabbis or teachers? And what happened in my case was I was 58 when this happened. And yes, if I could have made it happen, and I couldn't make it happen, it just happened. It was acausal. But if I could have made it happen years earlier, of course I would. It's so freeing to be free of prejudice that you don't even know you have. I didn't think I was prejudiced. I just thought the Palestinians were a bunch of psychopaths. But I want to point out, when I had this awakening, which lasted for quite a while, there was a moment where it was almost like obligatory, where I felt like I should blame my elders for having brought me up with these false beliefs. And that vanished within seconds. I had no reason to hold on to something like that. They had been just as duped as I was. And they were even more duped. They had even more defense for being duped because they came out of the Holocaust. And so they were operating out of real fear, real existential fear. The Jews needed a safe haven so they would not be exterminated again. And I want to point out that what I discovered is that the basic posture of human beings is existential fear and confusion. Confusion always accompanies existential fear because existential fear is the veil through which we perceive the world. And the opposite, which is what happened to me, is that my existential fear and confusion was transmuted into compassion and clarity. Compassion, when you see the world from a 360-degree perspective without any identification with one side or another, one tribe or another, you can hear or see their point of view without prejudice and understand it, whether you find it inaccurate or not. And compassion is always accompanied by clarity, because compassion, since it allows you to see from a 360-degree perspective, allows you to be more clear in your understanding of what's going on. And so I thought that was very important. But the main point that I wanted to make was that I felt no regret, even though, yes, I would have liked it to happen much earlier, but I felt no regret and I felt no anger towards anybody.
So again, as behavior analyst, I can tell you that Israel's indoctrination machinery is highly, highly sophisticated. And case in point, I don't know if you know the Peled family, Miko Peled and Nurit Peled El-Hanan.
Yeah.
I interviewed both of them actually, but Nurit, so his sister, studied racism in Israeli school books. Yeah.
Right.
So basically, Israelis, they get indoctrinated right after kindergarten, right? Indoctrinated in the most sophisticated way. Not only what is described, but how it is described, which pictures are used, even what colors are being used, yeah? All these kind of things. So, and that goes back generations. Yeah?
I know.
You said Holocaust. We can forgive the Jews that came to Israel after the Holocaust. Yeah? That's not the problem. It started in 1880, right? So there,
right.
It's a different story. Yeah? So it's a very nuanced...
Actually, what I tell people in my speeches is don't waste your time trying to convince hardcore people that Israel is abusing the Palestinian people and violating international. Don't waste your time. You need to speak to people who aren't sure what's going on, who are on the fence, who are not so attached emotionally to the state of Israel being a light unto nations and being an innocent country that just wants to defend itself.
Absolutely. So, you have three different audiences: the people who are absolutely against you, the people who are with you, and the people in between. So on those extremes, you don't have to focus. It's in the middle that's the most fruitful. Yeah.
Exactly.
There's one element that you have not mentioned yet. Yeah. So these days, in past times it was school. Now it's ChatGPT. So I asked ChatGPT a little bit of information. So I have one or two lines for your books and one or two lines about you. Rich Forrest's transformation from a supporter of Israel policies to advocate of the Palestinian rights reforms is expressed much in his writings. His books are not only guides for personal and spiritual growth, but also manifestos for social and political change, urging readers to apply the principles of compassion and humanity to real-world issues like the Palestine-Israel conflict. And all of this becomes more interesting if you consider that you have been a former member of AIPAC. Yeah? So for you, this transformation is even, I don't want to say more extreme, but it's more profound than maybe, in other circumstances.
I agree with that. Well, it's more profound because it didn't just affect my views on Israel-Palestine, it affected my perspective on everything. And it also, I do believe, I can't prove this, but I do believe I think a lot more clearly than I used to think, because my emotions or my preconceived ideas or beliefs don't really get in the way very much at all on any issue. And I feel like I'm more, I can see where someone is coming from more easily. I'm not as duped, let's say, by a smooth-talking con man. And there's a lot of con men in the world. They often call themselves politicians. But yes, that is the situation.
Yeah. Before we move on, I would like to shout out your books. Yeah. So the first one is Breakthrough: Transforming Fear into Compassion. And according to ChatGPT, the book reflects Forrest's journey from fear and bias to empathy and understanding, using his experience with AIPAC as a backdrop. That was the first book. And then we have Wake Up and Reclaim Your Humanity. Forrest's call for spiritual and ethnical awakening includes a plea for recognizing and addressing the injustices faced by Palestinians, influenced by a shift away from AIPAC. Now, I want to highlight that ChatGPT, and I don't trust it at all, because I have actually a video. ChatGPT is extremely pro-Israel biased. Yeah, I have the proof. There's a video I did. Yeah, but in these kind of general information, it's not so bad. So in both examples of describing a book, AIPAC is mentioned.
That's a bit of an exaggeration.
Okay.
The reason it's an exaggeration, I joined AIPAC not because AIPAC didn't influence me in any way. I joined AIPAC because I was already influenced. I already shared their views. And so I joined AIPAC because I thought, well, you know, they're helping the Jewish people in Israel. That's why I joined them. So AIPAC did not influence my views at all. It was my views that influenced me to join AIPAC because we had a common view at the time. Now I see that AIPAC is an arm of the Israeli government, that it is completely deceitful and dishonest, and AIPAC should be, I think it should be criminalized, but at the very least, it should be, in the United States, it should be considered a agent of a foreign government, and therefore there should be no tax-deductible donations. Actually, the U.S. government should shut them down. They do not want peace.
For viewers who don't know, can you, because you are a former member, yeah? Can you, again, in a nutshell, can you describe what AIPAC is and what it does?
Yeah, AIPAC is the American Israel Political Affairs Committee, and they're probably the most powerful. People used to say the National Rifle Association was the first most powerful lobby organization in the U.S., and AIPAC was second. I think AIPAC now is number one. First of all, Congress people pander to AIPAC. That's why 75% of the members of Congress will attend the annual AIPAC convention and give speeches about how wonderful AIPAC is and how wonderful Israel is, and then they get money. And for example, I live in the Boulder, Colorado area, and my representative is Joe Neguse, who is an African American, and he is his biggest financial supporter is AIPAC, and he always takes the AIPAC stance. And I've written to him a number of times. I said, since you're an African American, I assume you're a bit more sensitive to the evils of segregation than the average person. So why are you supporting Israel's segregation, which is as bad as segregation in the Deep South in the 1950s and before? And of course, he doesn't answer. And then I've even written to him and said, Joe, I assume, based on your stance on Israel, that if you were a congressperson in 1964, you would have voted against the Civil Rights Bill. And of course, he doesn't answer. But it's obvious how can anybody support genocide, which is what's been going on since October? But even before that, what Israel was doing was so blatantly illegal and criminal and cruel and sadistic. How can anyone, especially a black person in America, who has family, who has a heritage of incredible discrimination in this country, how can they support the same thing in Israel? It just shows how AIPAC has infiltrated the political system and really caused it to. It's just depraved. The political system has really gone hog wild. There's not a lot of Congress people who are really honest anymore.
And I believe it's a global organization, right? It's not limited to the US.
I'm not sure. They once told me, I was speaking to one of the people who worked for AIPAC, and I said, I'm not going to give any more money to AIPAC because AIPAC should be, if they really care about Israel, they should be insisting that the Israeli government make peace with the Palestinians. And she said to me, well, we don't have an opinion. We just do what the state of Israel tells us to do, what the government tells us to do. So they're really an arm of Israel.
Yeah. There is actually quite an interesting documentary from Al Jazeera. It's called The Lobby. I don't know if you saw it.
I've seen parts of it, yeah.
Yes, there are 4 parts. I will put a link in the description of this video. Yeah? What was interesting, so someone infiltrated AIPAC, and then AIPAC asked this infiltrator to go undercover against the enemies. And this is all filmed and documented and recording. This is the most interesting twist I have seen in a long time in a documentary. But what's interesting here is that it actually exposes, with with recorded evidence how AIPAC actually operates.
Yes, and AIPAC, some of the higher ranking members of AIPAC have been caught spying, illegal spying. I guess they had sensitive positions in the government and they had spied and given information to Israel, but I think they ended up not being charged with crimes. AIPAC, as you probably know, this election cycle has devoted $100 million to defeating congressional candidates who are critical of Israel, like Cori Bush, who looks like she's going to lose in Missouri, and they already defeated Jamal Bowman in New York. And the thing is, AIPAC, most of AIPAC's members are Jewish. Most Jews are Democrats, tend to be liberal in their political thinking, and yet AIPAC will support far right candidates for Congress if they, and they all are, all the far right in the United States is all 100% aligned with Israel, but they will support a far right candidate against a Democrat who is critical of Israel, even if the Democrats' values, other than Israel, are 100% aligned with most of AIPAC's members. So it's just really it's really a perversion of the political system, and what they're doing is trying to keep Americans from seeing what is really going on. They have such an effect that they prevent the news from making mainstream channels and really explaining what's going on. It's just really horrible because what's happening is this is what's so stark. Since 2002, the Arab Peace Initiative has been on the table, and Israel has ignored it and never once replied to it. But the Arab Peace Initiative, and I think it was first proposed in 1988, but it has been on the table since 2002. And what it would do is it would grant full diplomatic relations between Israel and every single Muslim country on earth, which I believe is 57 countries. It would end the dispute between Israel and the Palestinian people with a peace agreement. Generally, they're talking about the 1967 border between the state of Israel and the prospective state of Palestine, and it would provide security guarantees for all the states in the region. In other words, if Israel had accepted that, all these people, including Israelis, would not be dead today. Israel would be at peace with Yemen, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, Syria, and every other Arab nation. And instead, because of insane leaders like the megalomaniac Netanyahu, Israel does not want to make peace. They're willing to sacrifice their own citizens in their quest for more and more land and fewer Palestinians on the land. It is pure greed that has just totally taken over. And no one's stopping them. The United States goes along with it because they're afraid of the lobby.
You just said more and more land. So I don't know who told me, yeah, but this slogan, yeah, from the river to the sea, is actually an Israeli slogan. It's not a
That's right.
Palestinian slogan.
That's right. In the Likud party platform, and Netanyahu is a member of Likud, the Likud party platform explicitly states that the eastern border of Israel is the Jordan River, meaning everything west of the Jordan River, which is the West Bank and Israel, belongs to Israel. And Netanyahu has repeatedly said he would never make peace. And we don't have to get into this right now, but just very briefly, Israel has never negotiated in good faith. Even Yitzhak Rabin, he said, we will have less than a peace. And what his offer would have been, according to Ehud Barak, would have been about 66% of the West Bank, but not a full peace agreement. And he told that to the settlers. And he told the settlers that not a single settler would have to leave. And then Ehud Barak, who became prime minister soon after Rabin was assassinated, and negotiated the alleged Camp David summit in 2000, where Israel allegedly, and I believe this, made a generous offer to the Palestinians. No, it did not. In fact, Israel's own chief negotiator said that if he were a Palestinian, he would have rejected Camp David as well. And he said the concessions offered by Israel fell far short of even modest Palestinian expectations. So this is more propaganda where Israel makes the lies with the help of the Americans. Israel lies to the public that the Palestinians could have had peace, but they didn't take it. And they've been saying that since 1947 with the partition plan. that Israel accepted, that the Jews accepted, and the Arabs rejected. But what they don't say is that the partition Israel never would have gone, never intended to go along to honor the partition plan. For years before partition, Israel was lobbying for partition so they could get a foothold in Israel and expand a foothold in Palestine and expand into the whole of Palestine. Or as Chaim Weizmann, Israel's first president, said, we should accept a piece of land the size of a tablecloth. And Menachem Begin, who was the head of the Irgun at the time, future prime minister, he was very worried that the Arab states might accept partition. He wanted them to reject it because he knew if they accepted partition, Israel would have far less justification for expanding into the whole of Palestine because they would be breaching the borders of another recognized nation. So he was relieved, of course, when when the Arab nations rejected partition, and the Arab nations had made an offer where they would have one single state where Jews and Arabs in Palestine would all have equal rights. And of course, the Zionists immediately rejected that. So that's one of the main arguments. That and the Camp David Summit of 2000. Those are probably the two most prominent arguments out of many, but they're probably the two most prominent arguments Israel supporters make to justify what Israel is doing today. I mean, their logic is, well, the Palestinians rejected partition in 1947, therefore Israel's theft of the land, its occupation of Palestinian territory, and its current hostilities against the Palestinians are all the Palestinians' fault. That's kind of how they see things. It's really infantile and inhumane.
We know from Ben Gurion's letters to his son that he only accepted the partition, also the two-state solution, as a means to an end.
Correct.
And the end, of course, was the Greater Israel. So from the very beginning, Israel never exchanged peace for land. It always went for land.
That's right. And in fact, in the mid-1950s, when Ben Gurion was prime minister, he was talking about Israel expanding and taking over all of Jordan, taking the southern half of Lebanon and creating a Christian Maronite nation in the upper half of Lebanon, and I think taking part of Iraq. And the United States and Russia were so irritated with that they almost had Israel expelled from the United Nations. So, but yes, that's the case. Israel really has always wanted all of the land. And I'm not even sure why. It's not a biblical thing, at least not from the point of view of most of the Zionists, because they were atheists. It seems like it's just really human greed and an obsession that has taken over, where they think they need to have all this land for ego, for just to enhance the state of Israel, not just land area wise, but also in the estimation of humanity, I guess, for posterity. It's absurd, but there'll never be a light into the nations treating people the way they treat people.
There is no religious reason to have, well, actually it's the opposite. Yeah? So I interviewed Emeritus Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, and he told me that from a religious point of view, it's almost blasphemy for humans to create the state of Israel, because God was supposed to do that. Yeah. So many of those ultra-Orthodox Jews, they absolutely reject Zionism, and this is hardly ever mentioned here in the Western media. Yeah.
Well, yes, the initially when Israel was becoming a state, the staunchest Zionists, to a large extent, were anti-Semites. They were European anti-Semites who wanted to get rid of the Jews, so they supported the establishment of a Jewish state. The staunchest anti-Zionists were religious Jews because, as you said, they saw man or a nationalistic movement that would create a Jewish state as blasphemy towards the Torah, which says that only the Moshiach or Messiah from the house of King David can establish a Jewish state. However, nowadays, most of the aside from Natarai Karta, which is a wing of the Satmar Hasidim, the Satmar sect of Hasidism, many of the Orthodox Hasidic or just Orthodox sects of Judaism who don't believe in Zionism, they still support what Israel is doing. They still think that Israel is only defending itself. And then there's the religious Zionist party like Bezalel Smotrich, is the head of the religious Zionism. So they don't really embrace political Zionism because political Zionism really was atheist. But but religious Zionism, they do justify the taking the land of Palestine through biblical reasons, you know. And so, and they get crazier and crazier every year with their justifications. They'll quote passages from the Torah that are very bloodthirsty, and as
Amalek.
yeah,
Netanyahu mentioned Amalek. Yeah,
Netanyahu's been mentioning
maybe
Amalek
you
for
explain.
years.
You explain what it means.
I think it's in the book of Joshua where God insists that the Amalekites must be destroyed, every one of them. And Netanyahu uses, in fact, when Netanyahu was running for prime minister in, I think, 2009, and he was behind in the polls, he went on TV and started talking. The Arabs are voting. You have to get out and vote because the Arabs are voting. Amalekite is voting, and that, of course, will scare. Remember, the Likud was more embraced by the right wing, of course, and by religious Jews than, let's say, the late Meretz, the more liberal of the Israeli political parties. And so he was appealing to religious people's fears that they've been brought up with all their lives, that the Arabs want to destroy the Jews, and they are Amalekites. We have to destroy them.
We have to
So
explain this in a little bit more detail because I see it actually happening right now in Gaza because Amalek means kill all women, children, donkeys, dogs, and everything. Yeah,
yeah,
literally.
literally. And
Yeah.
I've seen, I don't know how if you've looked, but I've seen numerous, not just Knesset members, not just members of not just Netanyahu and members of his cabinet, but numerous rabbis calling on Israel to do just what you said: kill every man, woman, and child. One rabbi was more moderate. He said, kill every Palestinian over the age of 3. And they actually, and they actually think that that's an expression of compassion. They think there's a book called The King's Torah, which was written by two Orthodox rabbis. And in the book, it says that it's okay to murder a Palestinian child if you think he's going to grow up to be a terrorist. And when the book was published, I forget, a number of years ago, there was an outcry amongst some people in Israel. And criticizing the book and for saying that. And about 50 rabbis publicly came out and defended these rabbis for writing the King's Torah. But one of the things that the King's Torah says is that it is an act of compassion to kill Palestinians because you're ridding them of their of their evil inclination. And as if these guys are emphasizing by killing Palestinian children, as if and babies, as if these rabbis are in touch with their good inclination, which is the Yetzer Hatov. It's called in Hebrew. Yetzer Hatov is the good inclination. So this is how twisted they get, and this is what I'm saying. They're seeing the world and interpreting the world through this veil of illusion that includes the beliefs and images of a Jewish people who see themselves as superior, which a lot of Orthodox do, and as always being the victims of anti-Semitism because non-Jews are jealous of Jews and want to rid the world of Jews. They see everything through that lens. If for example, a Jewish person who has that attitude that the world is anti-Semitic, that the Arabs are bloodthirsty psychopaths, if he saw a person on the street having a heart attack, if he knew the person was a Jew, he would probably help the person. But if someone said, oh, that's a Palestinian, and a lot of Palestinians look a lot like Jews, he would let the person die. And that's exactly how Baruch Goldstein was. Baruch Goldstein was the Jewish doctor from Brooklyn who on Purim Day in 1994 waited in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron and then killed, I believe, 27 men and with a shotgun, his army shotgun or machine gun, and wounded something like 150 before he was subdued and killed. But that's how he was. He would not treat any Palestinian in distress, even though he was a doctor. So to him, the Hippocratic Oath was secondary to his prejudices. And he said that his only authorities were Meir Kahane, the Jewish rabbi who was the head of the terrorist organization Kach, who's dead. He was assassinated, and Maimonides, the middle-aged philosopher, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson, who had died, I think, a year before Goldstein conducted his slaughter. And I read where Maimonides, who's considered the greatest biblical commentator of the Middle Ages, where he said something like, if you see someone drowning, of course you should save them, unless, of course, he's a goy, a non-Jew. Okay, and so this is the attitude. It gets crazy. What I think is going on is a lot of people criticize the Talmud. But the Talmud, from what I understand, and I've never studied it, but from what I understand, the Talmud includes all arguments anyone ever made. So when you're in yeshiva, when you're a student in the yeshiva, people, the teachers are getting you to give your point of view on a particular issue. And there's all kinds of points of view. And no matter how bizarre they are, how inhumane, or even how stupid they are, I think they get put into the Talmud. And I think some of these authority figures, some of these rabbis, some of whom are probably not very intelligent, they'll see an argument that appeals to them, and they'll say, well, that's part of our religion. That's important. We should do this because these people are inferior. So we need to subdue them and treat them like dogs or make them our slaves.
Talking about treatment, yeah, there was just now, I think a week ago, this incursion in a what was it, an Israeli military base where 2 or 3 Israeli soldiers were incarcerated because they raped Palestinian inmates, which meanwhile have died. Yeah. So, and then I read that, and I have to say I do not recall the name, but there's a public discussion on, I think in the Knesset or so, if rape is justified.
Not only that, but the military base was raided by a bunch of right wingers who objected to the fact that any of these soldiers who had raped people had been incarcerated. Okay, they think that it's okay to do anything, and it's very interesting. If Israel is so capable of crowd control to the point where American police departments from various cities in the United States, such as Ferguson, Missouri, go to Israel to learn crowd control. If Israel's so great at crowd control, how come they can't stop their own citizens from raiding a military base or from preventing humanitarian aid from entering Gaza? They always fail. They always fail, and yet they're so good at controlling Palestinian crowds. Okay, it's hypocrisy.
This incident, to me, I mean, I may be wrong, yeah, but indicates almost there is a fracture going on within the Israeli society itself.
I agree. But when you look at the polling, something like every time Israel invades Gaza, whether it was 2008, cast lead, 2012, 2014, etc., always more than 90% of the public supports the invasion. In this case, the invasion that we're now seeing that started in October, I think I read 98% of the Israeli public supports the invasion, and 58% believe that that Israel is not being tough enough. And a lot of, as we've said earlier, a lot of these people really believe in wiping out the Palestinians. And some people will say, well, they just want to ethnically cleanse them, move them to other countries. I don't agree with that. I think their preferred outcome is killing them all. And the reason I say that is because when you're afraid that when you've done bad things to another people, you project onto them and think they're going to want to do to you what you would want to do to them. And people can't sleep at night if they are worried and they have all these enemy images of Palestinians, if they're worried that maybe a Palestinian will break in again like they did on October 7th. Better they should be dead. Then a dead Palestinian cannot haunt me, so they say. Okay, and just the other day, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, who's truly a monster, he was saying, well, first of all, he has made sure that the 21,000 or so Palestinians in Israeli prisons are getting as little food as possible to eat, cannot take showers for like a month, only wear diapers. They're harassed, sexually abused, belittled, humiliated, made to sleep chained on the floor, horrible things. And he's complaining, and he has a bill before the Knesset to rectify this situation. He wants to institute the death penalty on as many people as possible. And one of the things is there's like 21,000 Palestinians in Israeli prisons, but the prisons only have room for something like 13 to 15,000. So if we can put 7 or 8,000 to death, well, then we won't have an overcrowding problem, and we'll kill two birds at one stone. We'll get rid of more Amalekites. This is the thinking. It's insane.
There just came a report, either from B'Tselem or from Amnesty International, I'm not sure, but it's called Welcome to Hell. And it describes the conditions. It was just, I think, 3 days ago, yeah? It describes the conditions in the Israeli jails for Palestinians. There was just this case where this and it's taped on video. They arrested a woman, I think even in the West Bank, not in Gaza, in Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. Then first they amputated both of her legs to some illness, and then now she's dead. Yeah, that type of things. I mean, this is unheard of. And in addition, we have now images coming out of Gaza, which are comparable. If they would be black and white, you wouldn't know, is it now a Nazi concentration camp or is it now in Gaza? Yeah, hunger.
Thomas, let me read you a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu that he said on the William Buckley show. William Buckley was a popular conservative commentator, and this was in 1986 when he was the UN ambassador. This is what Netanyahu said, quote, "What terrorists do is target the innocent deliberately, and therefore my definition of terrorism is a systematic and deliberate attack, the murder, maiming, and menacing of innocents, of civilians for political goals. You can tell a lot about terrorists by what happens when they come to power. Those who fight for freedom and come to power do not impose terrorism. Those who do, who fight in terroristic means, end up as being masters of terrorist states." So he's describing himself and he's describing Israel in 1986. So it's all projection. It's all a projection. It's just amazing how everything I hear from the Israeli side about Palestinians describes themselves perfectly. It reminds me of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is always lying. But Donald Trump, when he describes things, it seems like he's being as precise as anyone could be in describing himself, except that he's attributing it to someone else. And I claim that if you want to understand Israel, just look at Donald Trump, or if you want to understand Donald Trump, just look at Israel. Israel is the Donald Trump of the world's nations, and Donald Trump is the Israel of human beings, of individual human beings. It's a real. This is why I call it a psycho-spiritual problem. It's a problem of identity. The beliefs and images that these people have is what is causing them to see the world in a way where they think Palestinians want to kill them. And so what are they doing? They're killing Palestinians, you know? And by the way, I want to point out, none of these people, I have not met a single supporter of Israel who sees who cares about Israel or is defending Israel. Not a single one. What they are caring about and what they are defending is their own presumed limited and mortal identity. And because they do not want to see themselves the way they see Israel, because Israel is such a part of their identity, they cannot acknowledge that Israel is behaving inhumanely and cruelly and even illegally, because that would reflect upon them. So what they are seeing when they look at Israel are the idealistic images of Israel that they project onto Israel, the innocent Israel, the Israel that is always having to fight for its life against anti-Semitism, the Israel that wants to make peace. Those are all idealistic images, and that's what they see. They do not see Israel. They can't even see Netanyahu for who he is. And I have to just point out, in the 1990s, when I was very pro-Israel, the one thing about Israel that actually nauseated me was when I would see Benjamin Netanyahu when he was prime minister. When he would speak, I would actually feel a revulsion in my body, and I couldn't watch him. I didn't know what was going on, but I think now what it was something in me was telling me, don't trust this guy. This guy is really a inhumane person who has nothing but really, really evil designs on the Palestinian people. And he is messianic. He does think of himself as a modern day Moses.
Interesting. Because you mentioned Trump, yeah, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, there is an article that I read where he discusses to get rid of all Palestinians from Gaza for beachfront property. I mean, that's actually what he said. Yeah.
Yes, I read that. When I was in Gaza in 2012, and it was, every building had mortar holes in it. It was, and a lot of places you would go, you would smell the stench of sewage. But, it's on the Mediterranean. I was thinking, Israel really would like to get this land because they would make it another Miami Beach. And that's kind of what Kushner wants, just because he can profit from it. Greed, and I mean, the inhumanity of these people is just astonishing. How people are so out of touch with their humanity that all they can think about is beachfront property without putting themselves in the place of Palestinians, without stepping into their shoes and seeing how they would feel.
If this is the leadership, yeah, and Jared Kushner, of course, was negotiator, yeah, for the U.S. in various, yeah, you would think there is some kind of understanding or deeper understanding, yeah, but it's just not there.
Right. That's what's so amazing. I'm constantly amazed at how the United States seems to always do the exact wrong thing. So we may end up with a war in the Middle East involving numerous countries, or even a world war, all because the United States is not willing to acknowledge what Israel is doing. Joe Biden, again, this goes to self-imagery or identity. Joe Biden defines himself as a proud Zionist. And he says if there weren't, he even said this recently, but he said it before October 7th. But I even heard him say it in the last few weeks. If there were no Israel, America would have to invent one. And so what's happening is because when it comes to the Israel issue, because he labels himself and identifies as a proud Zionist, that is the lens through which he sees the issue. So he's unable to have compassion for all the suffering of the Palestinians, and he may criticize Netanyahu, but he continually allows Netanyahu to get away with whatever Netanyahu wants to get away with, including this recent killing of Ismail Haniyeh. Okay. And by the way, I just want to point out, Haniyeh was one of the main negotiators of the ceasefire that we were hoping to see, although I knew that Netanyahu wouldn't agree to a ceasefire. But in 2004, Sheikh Yassin, who was the head of Hamas, had proposed a long-term ceasefire and a peace agreement, and Israel assassinated him 3 weeks after he made that proposal. Then he was replaced by Rantisi, and Rantisi reiterated the proposal, and then he was assassinated because Israel does not want to make peace at all. And Hamas, over the years, by the way, has made more than a dozen peace proposals, legitimate, that have been acknowledged by the New York Times, Jimmy Carter, the U.S. Army War College at the Strategic Studies Institute, and Israeli heads of Mossad and Shin Bet, all of which the government of Israel has always completely ignored because they don't want to make peace. And they want to make sure that there's a split between Hamas, previous to this situation, that there would be a split between Hamas and the PLO so that they could have an excuse. Well, we can't make peace. How can we negotiate with the Palestinians when Hamas and Mahmoud Abbas's political party don't agree? They can't agree on anything. So how can we make peace with them? They're not ready to negotiate. It's all a fraud that Israel is perpetrating.
Yeah, Netanyahu financed Hamas as a counterpiece to Fatah in the West Bank, yeah, for years via Qatar. Yeah. So there's one element that in these kind of discussions is almost a parallel level of discussion, yeah, and that's the geostrategic element here. Yeah. So the reason, I believe, yeah, the reason that why America keeps supporting Israel is simply geostrategic. Yeah, America is, in my point of view, an empire in decline, and you see it everywhere. It's now 35 trillion in debt. That means they pay more interest every month to pay back their loans than they spend on their complete military spending, which is astronomical. Their military spending, yeah, and their lifeblood is oil. Is actually the petrodollar. Yeah, and now you have competition via BRICS. Saudi Arabia joined already in January. Yeah, I don't have to tell the whole story. But the more America weakens, the more it has interest to keep Israel where it is and how it is. Yeah, in order to maintain a hegemony. Yeah, at least.
Yes, that is one of the arguments that people make for American support for Israel. But of course, I think a bigger argument is the fact that both AIPAC is so powerful, that the banks, that there's a lot of wealth in the United States that is controlled by Jewish people. Like, for example, Mitt Romney, when he ran for president, I believe his 8-member foreign policy advisor board were all Jews who had dual citizenship with Israel. And Romney said the first thing he would do if he became president was speak with Benjamin Netanyahu, not Putin, not Xi Jinping, Benjamin Netanyahu. But what's amazing is that if Israel made peace with the Palestinians, then the United States wouldn't need to have such a geostrategic presence in the Middle East. Israel and the United States, I don't support the Ayatollahs in Iran, but the people of Iran, I think the majority of people in Iran want to get along with the West, and they do not have evil intentions. But if the United States, instead of supporting Israel's degradations and its crimes against humanity, if instead it insisted, and it could insist, and make Israel make peace, a fair peace, there wouldn't be such a need for a state of Israel in the Middle East to kind of strategize about what to do with the rest of the Middle East. I think there would be a much greater peace throughout the entire region. And again, it goes to the Arab Peace Initiative. Israel could have full diplomatic relations, security, and full peace if it accepted the Arab Peace Initiative, which is negotiable. There doesn't even need to be, I'm pretty sure the Arab Peace Initiative would not require, the Arab countries would not require a right of return, maybe a nominal right of return of 5,000 Palestinians into Israel proper, but that Israel would not have to worry about that. But Israel wants all of Jerusalem, the fanatics, the religious fanatics, they want the holy sites, and so they're willing to go to war.
I don't want to go in this direction, yeah, but there are parallels between Russia, Ukraine, and Gaza, right? So we said already, there is no, in my point of view, there is no real interest from America on a geostrategic level to have peace in the Middle East with Israel in the center. On the other side, we had peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, and Putin actually showed the signed contracts, and then the Americans sent this clown, Boris Johnson, and said, no, you will not sign this, you will fight till the last Ukrainian. Yeah. So again, another example where we clearly see the US is not interested in peace. They live from war. Their whole economy is based, people don't realize. No war, America will collapse.
It's just unbelievable. And Boris Johnson didn't know anything about the facts, about the history of the region. Just like Tony Blinken doesn't know anything about the history of the region. Tony Blinken, as the U.S. Secretary of State, when he went over to Israel the first time, he said, "I come as a Jew." He didn't say, "I come as American." I come as a Jew. In other words, I'm one of you. I'm part of the tribe. And what did he do? I heard him 3 times. I heard Blinken 3 times say, "When I look into the eyes of a Palestinian child, I see my own children." And the first time he said it, the very next day, Israel bunker bombed and killed hundreds and hundreds of children in Gaza because of weapons that Tony Blinken allowed Israel to have without congressional approval. So this insanity has got to stop. I don't know how we stop it, because if people have these faulty beliefs in their mind, if there's such a huge number of people with so much power who believe that Israel really is just defending itself against terrorists, it's really hard to accomplish anything peaceful. And I want to point out that Israel, since 1948, has always, according to its leaders, has always deliberately targeted civilians, women and children included, from David Ben-Gurion and Yigal Allon. Yigal Allon was the most prominent Israeli general in 1948, all the way up to the present. Israel has always targeted civilians, and Israel has never negotiated peace in good faith. And so it's a very delicate situation, but at some point, the world either has to, especially the United States, either has to really take responsibility for its behavior and recognize that it cannot allow Israel to pervert international law, to just thumb its nose at it constantly, and to create all this suffering in the world. It's not just the Middle East that's suffering. The effects of what's going on really affect much of the world. At a certain point, the United States either has to put its foot down or there's just going to be world war and immense suffering everywhere throughout the world, I think.
Israel supported and supports extreme regimes around the world. And it was Nelson Mandela who said he will never forget what Israel did for the apartheid regime, which Israel supported basically till the last day. I have a whole list of countries where genocide happened, where mass slaughter happened. Till the last day, Israel is selling weapons there. Yeah? Now, we can talk about terrorism for a moment, yeah? But I just pulled out another article. Yeah? I'm reading from my notes. Israel Culture magazine Mekomit, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Mekomit, published on 28th of October a leaked document issued by Israel's Ministry of Intelligence recommending the occupation of Gaza and total transfer of its 2.3 million inhabitants. Yeah? This was leaked 3 or 4 days after October the 7th. That means this plan was already there. Yeah? So I often say this October the 7th was a God-sent gift for Netanyahu.
Yes, yes. Israel used it as a pretext to do what they've always wanted to do in the first place. And that's one of the reasons why they fabricated these stories of beheaded babies and exaggerated claims of rape. The UN, with Israel's compliance, because the head of the UN Commission was pro-Israeli, did a very thorough study and could not find any evidence of any rapes, any witnesses, any bodies, anything at all. Now, I have found one woman who seems legitimate who was raped by a Palestinian, but look at all the rapes that Israeli soldiers are committing. Okay, but the fact is, I want to tell you a little story. When I came back from Gaza in 2012, I landed in the United States and I had to take a cab from the train station. I took a plane. Anyway, I got to a train station. So I wanted to take a cab to my house. So I picked the first cab I saw, and it turned out that the driver was Egyptian. He had lived in the United States for a few years, but he had come from Egypt. And he said, "Where are you coming from?" And I said, "I was just in Gaza." And you know what he said? This was in 2012. He goes, "Oh, Israel has been wanting to get rid of all the people from Gaza and push them into Egypt so the Jews could take over Gaza." Then I subsequently read something by Noam Chomsky, in which he said the same thing, that that was a plan all along. And in 2014, Moshe Feiglin, who was the deputy prime minister, and he's a religious Jew, right wing, he came up with a plan to do exactly that, where they would, all the people of Gaza, if they voluntarily left Gaza, they would be left alone. They'd be given, I think, $35,000 and relocated in Egypt. And anyone who didn't want to leave would be considered an enemy combatant. And of course, the plan was, as most Israeli plans are, was in violation of international law. But this has been a dream of Israel all along. Israel has always wanted all of it, since before 1948. Okay, and that has never changed. They want it all.
I interviewed Professor Omar Bartov, and he told me he had this timeline. Yeah, so it starts with dehumanization, which we're seeing in Gaza and the West Bank. Then it continues with ethnic cleansing, which we see at least in Gaza, if not in the West Bank. And if you can't get rid of them, you kill them. Yeah, so that was his very blunt path to. And again, if you talk about genocide, yeah, you very quickly end up in a semantic discussion as per what is genocide definition. Yeah, irrelevant. What we are seeing on the floor, what we are seeing on the ground. Meanwhile, I think 40,000 dead, 100,000 severely wounded, no hospitals. But speaking of which, I almost fell off my chair, if it can be so blunt. I saw the interview with Benny Morris, whom I interviewed myself a while back. And he said Israel did not attack hospitals. I mean, the audience, it was a live environment. Yeah, the audience laughed at him. Yeah.
Yeah, he's gone off the deep end.
I don't understand. This is an intelligent man. What he did in the 1980s, yeah, with his research and his books was brilliant. Yeah. And I think it was Noam Chomsky who told me you have to divide Benny Morris. You have to divide Benny Morris from the historian, from the Benny Morris the person. Yeah. But as extreme, I think I saw it 2 days ago. It's very new. Yeah. I could not believe it, and the audience didn't take it. Yeah.
Well, Benny Morris, first of all, Benny Morris believes that in 1948, Ben Gurion should not have stopped at ethnically cleansing 700,000 Palestinians. He should have ethnically cleansed all of them. Benny Morris also has tried to walk back some of his research that he did in Righteous Victims, for example. In later years, he's tried to kind of soften Israel's image. But Benny Morris believes that Palestinians are serial killers and psychopaths. That's a quote. Okay. But one of the things about Morris is when he wrote Righteous Victims in particular, which really detailed the Israeli abuses in 1948 in particular, he didn't think that the public would be outraged by Israel's behavior because it was similar to other conquerors' behaviors. Whenever one country conquers another country, there's a lot of atrocities. It just happens to be the way human beings behave in this Kali Yuga that we live in. And so, but he didn't think that the world would take such offense at what Israel's doing. But what he didn't take into account was there was the history of the Holocaust, number one, okay, that made Jews even more eager, or made it more necessary for Jews to have a state of their own in their mind. And he also didn't take into account the fact that Jews have their own reputation, where their own self-imagery as innocent people who would never do to others what others would do to Jews. And now he's publishing all this material that shows yes, they would. And so, yeah, Benny Morris he did fantastic research years ago, but now some of the things he says really are bizarre. It's really, and this, again, another example of someone who cannot accept the reality of what is going on because of how it impinges on their belief system.
Yeah. I just pulled it up. It's a show from Al Jazeera. It's called Israel's War on Gaza, and it is, the interview is Mehdi Hassan. Yeah. So I will put a link in the description. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah.
Okay. So I would still go back to terrorism because you mentioned it already. Lehi, Haganah, Irgun, etc. Yeah? So those were terror groups, not because we call them terror groups, because they were classified or designated as terror organizations by the US and by the British. Yeah? Some of those terror organizations, or a number of consecutive Israeli prime ministers, actually were active members of these terror organizations. Right?
Well, Menachem Begin was the head of the Irgun, and Yitzhak Shamir was the head of the Stern Gang.
Yeah. And they even, people think they only, attacked in Israel and in Palestine. No. The British, they even tried to kill Winston Churchill. Yeah. They bombed the Hotel Sacher in Vienna. Yeah. Not to mention all the assassinations left and right. So Israel is virtually, absolutely, in the classical sense, or in the absolute sense of the word, a child of terror. It is born from terror. And sometimes I find it a twist in fate. What you sow, you will reap. To use a cliche. Yeah.
Well, the Likud party is the inheritor of the Irgun. The Irgun was led by Menachem Begin, who became prime minister as the head of the Herut party. Herut changed to Likud. But one thing I want to point out is that the Jewish terrorist gangs, and I include the Haganah in there, but the Irgun and the Stern Gang. The Stern Gang was an offshoot of the Irgun. It was much smaller, and the reason it broke off is because when the Jews of Israel, of Palestine, started seeing what a threat Adolf Hitler was, they suspended their activities against the British and decided to support the British against the Nazis. But the Stern Gang continued attacking the British. But the Jewish terrorist groups pioneered bombs in the marketplace, drive-by shoot bombs in buses. That was all pioneered by these really vicious Jewish terrorist organizations. And by the way, there's some pretty good evidence to indicate that these terrorist organizations killed more Jews than any other demographic. They would kill any Jew who did business with an Arab. They killed Jews who were sympathetic to Arab or were friends with Arabs. And that was a significant number. And one thing I want to mention is when you look at national liberation organizations, and whether you like Hamas or not, it is a liberation organization. It was formed with the help of Israel, but it was formed to liberate the Palestinians from the yoke of Israeli tyranny. When you look at these national liberation movements like the Algerian FLN, the IRA from Ireland, the Mau Maus of Kenya, the Tamil Tigers of Sri Lanka, all of them, their purpose, they all did things that we describe as terrorism, and that's regrettable. But all of them, their goal was to expel a foreign invader from their land. In the case of the Irgun, Sterngang, and Haganah, they were the foreign invaders. They call themselves liberation movements, but they were the foreign invaders who wanted to expel the indigenous people from the land. So they have less legitimacy, I believe, far less legitimacy than Hamas or any of these other groups, even though I don't agree with a lot of Hamas's tactics.
You just said something very interesting. You said that, these terror groups attacked many Jews. Yeah. Now I interviewed Professor Avi Schleim twice actually. He's an Iraqi Jew, and he told me about the story. I mean, I was aware of the Lavon affair in Egypt. Yeah, but Israel did the same in Iraq. So they attacked, they bombed their own Jewish population in Egypt and in Iraq to scare them, leaving their peaceful life, because they were not attacked prior to Israel being created. They lived their peaceful lives to scare them to go to Israel. Yeah. So, please.
I believe there were about 150,000 Jews who lived in Baghdad at one time. And pretty quickly, Israel got all of them to leave the country because of the false flag operations Israel was doing, where they were making it look, where Israel was bombing, I forget exactly what they were bombing, but bombing places in Iraq because they wanted to get the Iraqi people angry at the Jews, so the Jews would leave.
Yeah, and in this interview, Avi Schleim said with a smile on his face, "And I found the smoking gun."
Well, there's a book by Naim, I think it's Naem Giladi, Giladi. I forget the title of it, but it's mostly about the false flag attacks in Iraq that induced all these Jews to leave Iraq. But I mean, the Zionists even kidnapped Jewish children from Jewish parents in England and brought them to Palestine because they wanted a demographic. And by the way, this is very important. Most Jews did not want to go to Palestine. The vast majority did not. In fact, at the end of World War II, a poll was taken of the survivors of Dachau concentration camp, and only 15% said that they would be willing to go to Palestine. And I'm sure if they had gone, whatever number would have gone, probably about half would have returned, because there were a lot of Jewish immigrants to Palestine who hated it and returned. And so, but Israel needed to force Jews to have no choice but to go to Palestine. And that's what they did when they sabotaged Franklin Roosevelt's plan to take in all the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, 100%, that he came up with before he died in 1944. And the Western European countries had agreed to it. But what happened was he sent Morris Ernst, who was his lawyer and the head of the ACL, the founder of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and was Jewish. He sent Morris Ernst to speak to the Zionist organizations in the United States to get their blessing. And instead, they accused Morris Ernst of being a self-hating Jew, an anti-Semite, and they completely opposed it because they wanted the Jews to go to Palestine so there could be a state of Israel. So they were forced. Most of the Jews were forced to go. They had nowhere else to go.
And because Israel couldn't get enough people, they then considered taking Arab Jews in, like from Egypt and from Iraq, which is for me is such a oxymoron almost, because effectively what they do, they expel one group of Arabs and they put another group of Arabs in. This for me, it makes absolutely no sense.
Well, what about the Russians who have pork restaurants in Israel? They pretended they were Jewish, and I think Israel knew it, but they let them in, and now they have restaurants where they serve pork. Well, they're obviously not Jewish, probably. The odds are very high they're not Jewish if they're serving pork. But they pretend to be Jews.
Yeah. Rich, if we can conclude this interview how we started it, there's one topic, with your kind permission, I would still come back to, and it's AIPAC. Because I'm doing some research in regards to AIPAC. Yeah, you having been there, is there something you can tell us from the inside how AIPAC operates? How, for example, how to recruit people, what their strategy is, etc., etc.
Not really. I wasn't, associated with any of the insiders, but they appeal to the Jewish fear, which has been, the thousands of years, the multi-thousand year Jewish fear of extermination that was emphasized, obviously, in the Holocaust. And they appeal to the fact that there would not be a state of Israel. There would not be a state of Israel if we allow the Jewish people would not exist if we allow the Arab countries to do what they want to do, to conduct their operations the way they want to do it. It's based on fear. It's based on anti-Semitism, and it's also based on ignorance. Except they don't know that they're ignorant, but they constantly repeat the words of Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government when they should know that these are all lies. I mean, I almost never see an Israeli spokesperson telling the truth, and I certainly never see Benjamin Netanyahu telling the truth, even when he was prime minister in the late 1990s, and I was still a supporter of Israel. I always knew he was lying. So I don't know what else, there's not much else I can tell you about AIPAC other than that it has this huge power, huge amount of money, and huge influence. And they're destroying the world with those assets.
Yeah. Noam Chomsky said to me, they're going to blow up the world, but who cares? God is on their side.
It's like, I think Ilan Pappé said that the rulers of Israel will say things like, well, I don't believe in God, but he gave us the Holy Land.
Maybe one last thing, Netanyahu, yeah, and this is just a question because I don't know how much you know, yeah. So I looked into the 3 corruption charges from Netanyahu, and one stuck out for me. I even did an interview. I interviewed a writer, James Bamford. He's an investigative journalist in the US, and it seems, and for me, this was one of the most amazing stories I have heard so far, because there is a Hollywood billionaire with the name of Aaron Milchan, who is since his early 20s a spy for Israel. He has stolen nuclear secrets, and this is proven from FBI documents who were declassified thanks to the Freedom of Information Act. Yeah. Doing this for years, right? So this is known since decades. Various US administrations, Carter, Reagan, have shielded these kind of activities. Then, of course, we have the UNCOM affair where 200 kilos of yellow cake disappeared, all this kind of thing. So this puzzled me. I mean, American intelligence or they're not even shielding themselves against their most sensitive, nuclear secrets. What can be more sensitive than that? Yeah. And there is a side story to that, because there is this non-proliferation agreement that the US has signed. And if someone goes against this non-proliferation agreement, then support for Israel actually would have to be terminated. Right? I do believe that would be like Don Quixote fighting against windmills, anyone trying to, on a legal basis, get the US on that basis to stop sending money and arms to Israel. Yeah.
Well, let's just point out to the audience, Israel has between 100 and 400 nuclear weapons and is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement.
But America is.
But America is, yes. As is Russia, I believe.
Not sure about Russia.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, but I think they were, or were. But anyway, yeah.
But again, legally, if it would be proven, and I mean, come on, a blind one can guess, yeah? America knows that Israel has nuclear weapons. And that's the reason why they are not, calling out on Israel, because that would mean to admit that they know. Right. Anyway, that was a side story. So I have an interview with James Bamford who explains this. He investigated this. He wrote about this. But for me, Aaron Milchan produced more than 120 movies. Yeah, he Pretty Woman, 12 Years of Slave, Fight Club. So he's one of maybe even the top Hollywood producer. But he originally got his money from arms dealings, yeah, starting with South Africa till the end for Israel. There's a whole complex because he funded Israel's secret black ops with the money from those arms. It's an incredible story, yeah? And I'm surprised that no one is really picking this up. Anyway, that was a side avenue because you briefly mentioned spying. Rich, is there anything that you still have close to your heart that we didn't discuss today?
I guess what I would want to say is that my advice to people is don't be afraid of inquiring into your self-conception, your identity, and the beliefs and images that are part of that identity. There's nothing to fear. I often say that people are more willing to send their children to war than they are to inquire into their identity, because they're afraid, because as is the case, for example, not just of people who defend Israel, but anyone who has a strong connection or emotional charge with a particular subject, challenging their beliefs is like threatening them with death at an unconscious level. Okay, it bubbles up into the conscious, but to the ego identity, challenging someone who is so convinced of Israel's innocence, that Israel is not what it says it is and is the opposite of it, is a mortal threat. That's why I say that the root cause of suffering is the attachment to a presumed, limited, and mortal identity, and to the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that presumption. Okay, so if you can start to look at the world, start to look at your beliefs through that definition, and start seeing, well, how much of this is because I was just brought up to believe it? Have I ever really studied the subject? Have I inquired into it? And a corollary to that is that the real enemy is not someone or something outside of us. The real enemy is the unexamined and dualistic mind that unconsciously projects its suffering onto the other and then blames and scapegoats the other for its suffering. So if we can start getting more conscious of these tendencies within ourselves, peace would be so much more likely. We would start to see that I'm making this assumption just because of the beliefs I grew up with, but I never investigated them. Maybe I should have the integrity and take responsibility for my beliefs and look into them and see if I'm not just generalizing some negative enemy image onto a whole group of people when it may only apply to one or two, and the one or two it applies to, well, what induced them to act the way they did? What induced Hamas to bomb Israeli buses? Why would they do such a thing? It didn't just happen out of the blue, but many people act like it did just happen out of the blue, like it's just a reflection of their hatred, rather than a reflection of their frustration and their inability to get Israel to make any concessions, because Israel always shuts down nonviolent behavior and civil disobedience, always. So the only time the Palestinians ever get any concessions from Israel is after periods of violence.
That's fully in line with what Gideon Levy told me. He said, don't believe what they tell you, come here, and if it's only for 2 or 3 days, come here, look for yourself. I found this a very strong...
Right, I agree with him.
Rich, on that note, it was my absolute pleasure talking to you. I could go on and on. I mean, you have a vast repertoire of knowledge and topics. Yeah, I think we have not talked enough about your books and some other topics, but who knows? Maybe in the future.
That would be great, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye.